Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Design Through an Indigenous Lens, Decolonizing Our Approach to Architecture, and Matt Hickey. Welcome, everyone, to our Daniels Faculty Lecture, Design Through an Indigenous Lens, Decolonizing Our Approach to Architecture, with my dear friend, Matt Hickey. It's such a pleasure to welcome him to the school. My name is James Bird, and I'm a graduate student in my final year. I am from Treaty 8 territory in the Denisoonene and Neyo Nations of Northern Alberta. And it is my pleasure to moderate this lecture along with my co-host, Daniel's faculty assistant professor in the teaching stream, Adrian Pfeiffer. Adrian.
Thank you, James, so much. I'm so happy to have Matt with us today. I'd like to start by reading the land acknowledgements. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world. And we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the land from which we are joining us virtually today. I would also like to thank Mason White, Chair of the Public Events at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design, and Nini Brody and her team for organizing this event. I would also like to add that this event occurs in conjunction with the first-year Master of Architecture course studio, which is the result of a partnership with Haudenosaunee peoples and the Woodland Cultural Center located on the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory in Brantford, Ontario. Lastly, please note this event is being live streamed and recorded. If you do not wish to be captured, please turn off your video. We ask you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. You may add your questions in the chat for me to relay to Matt, or if you wish to ask your question directly, put your name in the chat and a note that you wish to ask your question on camera. Thank you very much again, Matt, and I'll pass it over to James now.
So I forgot to do this, but in my language, I wanted to just welcome Matt. And I would like to now introduce to you our speaker today. Matt Hickey is Mohawk Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, receiving his Master's of Architecture from the University of Calgary and his Bachelor of Design from the Ontario College of Art and Design. His background continues to have a significant impact on his work. Practicing architecture at Two Row Architects, located on Six Nations, for the past 14 years, he currently oversees design and development for the firm. Their core focus is on Indigenous design and architecture, designing buildings, landscape, and installations on and off reserve located all over Turtle Island. Matthew's focus towards sustainability is on the regenerative and restorative design, encompassing ecological, cultural, and economical principles. His work pushes the concept of integrated landscape, universal accessibility, food equity, the importance of water, and placemaking for all species, including humans. His research includes Indigenous history and architecture of Northern and Middle America, and realignment of Western ideology towards historical sustainable technologies for the contemporary North American climate. Currently teaching at the Ontario College of Art and Design University and critiquing at the University of Toronto for the past 3 years. He also believes that giving back and encouraging younger generations is key to moving Indigenous ways of thinking about design and architecture forward. He has lectured all over Canada, including most recently at the Architecture New Series at the University of Lethbridge. Art being in his blood, he is proud to be the director of the board of Artscape Toronto, Inc., and a member of the Waterfront Toronto Design Review Panel. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, James. That is a mouthful of an introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen now here. And we'll start the presentation. Is it good? All right, here we go. Thank you, Nyawe, for having me. Scano, Sego, Sagoli, Matthew Hickey Giasso, Hadni Zongwenhoma Giasso. My name is Matthew Hickey, and thank you, James, for that great introduction. I'd also like to thank Adrian Pfeiffer for the invitation to share some ideas about indigeneity and decolonization in architecture with the U of T community today. Adrian, I also want to thank you for your land acknowledgement. And along with that, I'd like to offer a teaching. This is a teaching that I think will help frame the conversation of Indigenous architecture within Canada. The Indian Act. So my business partner, Brian Porter, and I had the opportunity to speak at the REIC OAA AGM in 2017. The theme, like most things that year, was Canada 150. So we decided to talk about 150 years of Indigenous architecture, and then quickly realized that that was no small task. So we came up with this graph to represent areas of architecture that were influenced by or that influenced Indigenous architecture for the past 150 years. So this graph here, you can see on the left-hand side is a pink key that talks about Canada Confederation. So that shows you 150 years of Canada and the time that it existed. I should also say that every 2 degrees on this graph is a year in time. The pink lines in the back are the years that the provinces and territories joined into Confederation. The dark purples are some select residential schools. The blue is about the steel industry and the Skywalker, Mohawk Skywalkers. The gray wedges are the world wars. And the green is the beginning of Indigenous architecture and architects within Canada specifically, starting with Douglas Cardinal. The pink wedge there is truth and reconciliation. And the last piece that I'm going to speak about is the gold piece, which is key moments in the Indian Act. One of the first things that you'll notice is that the Indian Act continues to this day. So the Indian Act was enacted 9 years after Confederation. And I love this little graphic. It asks the question, you know, are they here legally? And then it says, I guess we'll have to wait until they write the laws to find out. So understanding that this act has been around since 9 years after Confederation and continues to this day is something very important for us to understand when we speak about Indigenous architecture. In 1884 was the banning of ceremony. So this move was mostly aimed towards the potlatch ceremony, which is mainly on the West Coast. But ceremonies are the basis of Indigenous life. And smudging, for example, which is what you're seeing the Prime Minister do here, is meant to, among other things, allow people to think good thoughts, to help see with good eyes, and help to listen and speak good words. Now, I use this image as a bit of a poke towards our current government, who has still not fulfilled their promise of clean drinking water on all of our reserves. In 1894, residential school policy was adapted into the Indian Act. And you'll notice if we go back to the graph that it started beforehand, but continued on and was official in 1894. This is the original Mohawk residential school, or what they call the mushroll. And this one was actually burnt down by the students. In 1914, dancing off reserve was banned. I mean, this sounds absurd to me. You know, as part of the criteria for the Indian Act was that we're going to ban dancing of a culture. So this was aimed at powwows, so people gathering from different reserves, and also the potlatch ceremony, which dancing is a major part of. In 1925, dancing was completely banned. So this is an image of the smoke dance, which is traditionally performed by the Haudenosaunee. And I used to always wonder why dancing was such a big deal, why the government made it such a big deal to ban dancing. And then I realized that it's not just a cultural act, but it's an act of healing. It's an act of communication. It's an act of bringing people together in community, which is so important to indigeneity, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of being. In 1927, the act prevented Indians from retaining lawyers without the permission of the government. So this was about ownership of land and land claims. An interesting fact when we had this conversation first time, we were in Ottawa, and the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation says they've never ceded control over what their traditional lands were. So that claim in particular includes the Ottawa River, the islands on the Ottawa River, and long stretches of the shoreline, including Parliament Hill, the Supreme Court, National Library, and the Canadian War Museum. These land claims are still going on to this day. In 1951, Indian status was subject to the rule of the Act. Indigenous people became subject to provincial law, even though their treaties are with the federal government or the Crown, and intoxicants were no longer allowed to be bought or sold on reserves. Some things to know: not all Indigenous people have status in the eyes of the Indian Act, and status is rooted in assimilation. Indian status was created under federal policies of assimilation and civilization, the same policies that were created and implemented in residential schools. In 1961, Indigenous people gained the right to vote and be educated. 1961. So before this time, if you got a university education, became a clergyman, or wanted to vote, you had to give up your status right, which means you couldn't go back to your home community, which means you were oftentimes ostracized from the people that brought you up. 1961. In 1969, the white paper was published by the original Trudeau government, and it was a clumsy attempt to address the systemic inequalities between Indigenous people, referred to as Indians, and settlers, referred to as Canadians. To accomplish this, they intended to fast-track the investigations of outstanding land claims and then terminate all treaties. After this, the Department of Indian Affairs would be dissolved and Indigenous people stripped of their status en masse. It was in effect a proposal to speed up the assimilation mission of the Indian Act, which had been slowly chipping away at Indigenous communities since its creation in 1876. The reserve lands would be transferred to the bands, and the residents would be subject to provincial and territorial laws that applied to settlers of Canadian settlers. They would also receive the same services, both provincial and federal. The reserves would essentially become municipalities. In 1985, Bill C-31 was introduced, and this is when I got my status back. My mother being Native and my father being white meant that when she married him, she lost her status. So I was 7 years old when this act came into effect, and I'm a Bill C-31B. The Indian Act was really pushing forward inequality between men and women. A lot of Indigenous cultures are matriarchal, and this was a bit of a flip to try and break the ways that Indigenous people were living. Some other key things: it was meant to prevent anyone from gaining or losing status through marriage. And this bill also was set out to restore Indian status for those who had lost it through discrimination or enfranchisement. In 1999, not too long ago, the First Nations Land Management Act came into play. The First Nations Land Management Act is a federal law enacted in 1999. It provides signatory First Nations the authority to make laws in relation to reserve lands, resource, and the environment. So now you would think that it's all about the management of land and resources, but it was more than that. First Nations under First Nation Land Management Act have the authority to create their own system for making reserve land allotments to individual First Nation members. They also have authority to deal with matrimonial real estate property in interests or rights. The First Nations Land Management Act states that First Nations are responsible for enacting rules and procedures in cases of breakdown of marriage, respecting the use, occupation, and possession of First Nations land, and divisions of interests in the First Nations land. This is the first time that Indigenous people were able to control the land that they have been living on for thousands of years. So if we come back to the this graph, I want you guys to think about all these things that are still in effect enacted as we live as Indigenous people underneath the Indian Act. If we go back to the green line on the graph, you'll see that that's the first registered architect, which was Douglas Cardinal in 1967, 6 years after we were allowed to become educated in the eyes of the law. This is one of the reasons why Indigenous architecture has been so behind, is because we were forced to be behind. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, today I'm going to speak a little bit about how we have been working through an Indigenous lens in architecture. I'm going to start with Indigenous architecture and what that may be and what that is not. I'm going to talk a little bit about ideas about universal inclusivity. I'm going to talk about the 6 F words. That's where the presentation gets a little spicy. And then I'm going to talk about process and what we've been doing in practice with a few case studies. So we often get asked about what Indigenous architecture is, and this is a difficult question to answer. So what we are seeing is a realignment of Western ways of thinking towards Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And this can be seen in the shift in architecture and design. So this is another diagram that we've been using, and I'm going to speak about half of it today, and I'll just quickly jump through the second half, but I want to start discussing how we're seeing this realignment of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So the gold circle is Indigenous architecture or ways of knowing and being, and the blue line is where we're going to begin. So starting with what Indigenous architecture is not. Forts. So Indigenous architecture is not forts. Now I've 1564 on here because that's when one of the first known forts was formed in North America. And this is a map of all the forts in the Greater Canada area. It was compiled in 1930 by Ernest Van Horst, PhD, for the Department of the Interior of Ottawa. And something you'll notice in this map, all those little blue dots, well, it might be hard to see, those are all locations of forts within Canada. And you'll also notice that those are along all the rivers and pathways that Indigenous people used to travel on for thousands of years and still do. So the idea of a fort is to secure the landscape, to secure trapping grounds, to secure trade routes, and to ensure that those resources are controlled. This is not Indigenous architecture. The next movement we see is railroads, and this starts in 1836. Railroads that move across Canada once we've passed the need or have the ability to no longer travel on the waterways within North America, we built railroads. And with those railroads came big buildings like the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel, which was built in 1888. These railroads provided for the rise of the Grand Hotel. So the idea here is that now we have control over these areas and we own the landscape. We can now enjoy it from inside our luxury castle. So the building is intended to dominate the landscape. This is not Indigenous architecture. Modernism, starting around the 1920s. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I am a huge fan of modernism. I love a lot of Mises buildings, but I'm going to talk about them from the lens of indigeneity. So this is the Seagram building, built in 1958 by Mies van der Rohe. And some things that go along with this building. There's no directionality to align with natural lighting or ventilation. All sides of the building are the same. So there's no context. These buildings are typically built on a podium or removed from their surrounding site and intended to be kind of universal in the way that they could be placed throughout the world. There's hierarchy in this building. You can tell the pay scale by which floor worker works upon and how close they are to a corner office. And there's been a bit of a movement away from this in thinking these days, but for all in all, modernism is not Indigenous architecture. The last one I'm going to speak in detail about is postmodernism, and I don't want to offend anybody if they've worked on this building, the Mississauga City Hall. But this for us is really an idea about the fact that Canada doesn't have a culture. You know, we had this agrarian culture and we needed to import something in order for us to make a building that created civilization. You can see this in the building form. You can see this in these ideas that are represented in it, in the landscape, the amphitheater, the colonnade along the building, the agora, you know, this marketplace that's created. And really, this is an import of an outside culture into Canada. And we really need to be moving past this. So this is not Indigenous architecture. So postmodernism is where we start to really see this alignment moving quicker towards Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And I'm going to skip through a bunch of these because I want to move on to other things, but we start to see it with the formation of things like the United States Green Building Council, thinking about the environment more, the 2000 United Nations Development Goals, or even closer to us in time is the well kind of system of classifying buildings and how they treat occupants, right up to 2015, where we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that were built on the previous ones. And if we talk about those for a quick second, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a collection of 17 global goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. These were set in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly and were intended to be achieved by the year 2030. I mean, there's a lot of goals for us to be achieved by 2030, including carbon neutral aspects. But this is one of the ways in which I think we can start thinking in a holistic way about how we not only treat other humans on this earth, but how we approach the land that we use, how we approach the resources that are around us to help guide us in thinking about how we then approach architecture and design. I had the opportunity to write an article with the Bentway Conservancy for Azure magazine last October. It was a great honor to be asked to write, and they said I could write about anything, which is also fun. So I started to write about what we're calling universal inclusivity. So in this article, I talk about differences in Indigenous and Western ways of knowing and being, and our need to adjust our mindset to these different ways of being. One of the quotes from the article is this one: "Decolonizing the way we think about design and architecture and the processes by which we create the built environment begins with taking humans off the top of the pyramid and placing them as an equal part of the circle." And if we continue that thinking, for us, Western ways of thinking about time, or for that matter, a design and consultation process, is very much linear. Typically, design starts at A, moving to B, and then on to C, with C not affecting B and B not affecting A. So an example of this can be seen as like Henry Ford's assembly line. This is a linear process intended to increase productivity, decrease skill, and increase profit. We can see where this need for speed has brought us in 2021, with the manufacturing and capitalism ruling the world. Indigenous ways of thinking about time are related to the natural cycles that occur around us. The cycles of the moon, the changing of the seasons, day into night, or even the cycle of life and death. We start at A, moving to B, and then on to C, always understanding that what we do now has an effect on what we call the future. So sometimes this is referred to as seventh generation teaching, but specifically within different Indigenous cultures, this is an understanding that we are connected to each other, to the natural world, to the cycles that surround us. In colonial ways of knowing and being, there's hierarchy. So you're always trying to work your way to the top, but everyone and everything will eventually be below you. So this can be related to humanity. You know, we think as humans that we are better than everything else around us, that we are special. In Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we place ourselves as part of the circle. This is non-hierarchical thinking. So we need to understand that humans are no more important than a drop of rain. This way of thinking informs how we approach our work and the processes by which we do consultation and work through our relationships with Indigenous clients and also non-Indigenous clients. So we've been thinking a lot about how to make cities and urban developments better, and kind of focusing on landscape and the urban realm here a little bit. So some people would argue that technology is the key to solving urban issues. But we've been thinking about how to enact universal inclusivity to help fix our cities and create better ones for everyone and everything. So we posed the question, what would happen if all the power goes out? What makes a city great then? And this is where we come to the 6 F words. And don't worry, this is all PG. So the 6 F words for us are food, flora and fauna, family, fun, and flexibility. So I'm going to start with food. Food is at the center of Indigenous culture. It is, a lot of our words are based around it, obviously, but the way that we speak and use food within ceremony is almost like it's a part of our sense of being. Yet, 1 in 8 households in Canada are food insecure, so amounting to over 4 million Canadians, including 1.15 million children. So living in homes that struggle to put food on the table. This is crazy to me. I think this is a result of monocrops in the way that we use factory farming, which requires vast transportation systems to bring food into our urban centers. So it typically requires use of pesticides and fertilizers, all which add to the contaminated soil and eutrophication. So we have to ask ourselves, is this the smartest way to grow food? Creating landscapes that are fruitful are not just aesthetically pleasing could be a way to help solve some of these issues. But it's not just about growing food on site, it's also about how we grow it. So the Three Sisters, which is a Haudenosaunee crop of corns, beans, and squash, is an example of how Indigenous peoples have been growing food for thousands of years. So the corn provides the stock for the beans to grow on, the beans provide the nitrogen in the soil, and the squash leaves help keep the soil moist and full of water, all of them contributing in their own way to the success of all 3 individual plants. So this technique is called a milpa, and it's really prevalent in the Americas, where they oftentimes would have 20 or 30 different plants in one field. So food is a key aspect in how we think about food security and urban agriculture within our cities and within our architecture is an important thing to remember when thinking about Indigenous architecture. We also want to think about flora and fauna, excuse me. Plants and animals are completely related to our food. Obviously, we grow them to eat them, and we also hunt them to eat them and have them as other resources as well. They're also a center of Indigenous culture. So we can think about this in kind of a scientific way as biodiversity. We should be promoting places, not just for people to live in, but also for animals, for insects, for trees, for plants, for medicines, for amphibians. They all need space as well. And not only does flora and fauna drive our ecosystems, but flora and fauna bring us enjoyment. Now, smart cities should account for diverse spaces for diverse species. This may be about migration, it might be about nocturnal animals, the natural trails in which they move, or even breeding grounds for specific species. All these placekeeping for flora and fauna benefits the animals, the flora and fauna, the plants and animals, but also humans. If we start realizing that, we're going to start bettering these places for everyone. We often forget that the balance of power can lie just in one insect. We have this severe issue with bees right now, and how if they disappeared, what would happen to our crops? What would happen to all the things that are supported by this one insect? We forget about that. So family is our next one. Family for me can also be a reference to community. And this pie chart is potential for tiny homeowners, but we're not going to talk about that subject. But the graph also shows a general breakdown of housing occupant types. So of note, singles, couples, and couples with children make up about 70% of the chart, with multi-generational and mixed households being around 7%. So I feel that we've lost our connection with family and with community in the way that we live. There are some people who still live in multi-generational households, but this is far less common than we think. The majority of us are raised as individuals to move out as soon as possible. I know I was encouraged to go to university as soon as I was done high school and get out of the house, basically. This has huge implications, especially in urban centers where rents and property are really unaffordable to a lot of people. So how we live and who we live with needs to create community, your selected family. This slide shows a cutaway of a cohabitation household. This typology is something that we should be thinking about to promote our future developments, whether it's in low rise, high rise, multi-unit. That's really important. I had the opportunity to live in Barcelona for a little while, and something that really struck me there was that these blocks, these super blocks in some cases, are really have all the services that you need. And thinking about, people being able to walk to their grocery store, to their pharmacy, and not having to get into a car, being easy to move around a city, and thinking about our city in much smaller communities and tight aspects where we can start to create communities within the larger place. I find a lot of our issues within living in Toronto or a larger urban center is that we are disconnected. You could live beside someone in your condo and you have no idea who they are. We need to create opportunities and for us to interact with other people, to create that community. Fun. So fun for me is reference to recreation, so the ability to universally enjoy a place. So fun can be as simple as the ability to be outside and being able to connect with nature, being able to connect with nature in an active way, or it might be just about creating spaces for play, unorganized and organized play, which also can be linked into formal and informal learning from the landscape, learning through play. Infrastructure, I think, is also a very important part of this. We need to create and support active living, whether it's through better planning of our layouts, how we get around the city, but then also ways for us to move, whether it's running, biking, walking, swimming, skating. I always wanted to see a skating path that ran right through the city. So in the winter, when it's cold, you can strap your skates on and move right through. The last F that I'm going to speak about is flexibility. So flexibility is about the ability for our cities, our urban realms, even our buildings and systems to adapt easily over time, right? They should be easily manipulated and easily adaptable, and it should be fairly free or cheap or cost effective to do that. Nothing irks me more when I see a piece of infrastructure go in, whether it's a bike lane or some sidewalk paving that's quite fancy, and then no less than a month later, they dig it up to put in a line, a gas line or something like that. I find that we're so unorganized with the way that we think about our infrastructure, that we don't think about the long-term effects that construction dust, and even just not having a place that's kind of settled for people to live, what kind of effect that has on our ability to be happy within these urban realms. So the integration of thoughtful infrastructure is something that we really think is important for a smart city. So shifting gears here a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about our process. We have a few processes that we usually use, but I'm going to go back to one that I used for my thesis with Christopher Clark, who's also an architect, and talk about how we move through Indigenous translations and artifacts. So for us, consultation is a key component of our work with Indigenous communities, but sometimes we are forced to work with limited or little consultation. So I'm going to talk about our approach that we would recommend to use in this case. So one of the ways we dive into design is through the artifacts that exist within a specific Indigenous culture. So we look at, if we're looking at the Coast Salish peoples like the Lekwungen or Wasanich, and we take a look at their art, ways of living, the tools that they use, and the landscapes that they inhabit. These ideas that are very specific to their culture and their language. What we're looking at here on the screen is some artifacts that Chris Clark and I made for our thesis that we're dealing with the Northwest Territory Métis Nation. And I'm going to talk about these translations, these artifacts, and how we are really taking ideas that are embedded in all these things that I just spoke about and trying to pull out the essence, the conceptual ideas that are embedded within each of these. So notice on the end there, this is the first artifact is the sled, the dog sled, which is really important to these northern peoples. So this object was distilled into the ideas of journey, ideas of movement, and also the ideas of track. You can see in there that the acrylic is milled out so that the sleds, if you will, the runners will sit perfectly in there, but they also leave a mark behind where they've been on the landscape. There's also the mention of the idea of craft, of bending wood. So all these ideas are inherent in this object here. The next artifact that we took a look at was clothing. So the essence of northern clothes is this idea about layering, including layering of leathers and furs. It's about ideas of insulation and creating warmth. And it's also about ideas of beadwork. There's a lot of decoration and symbolic imagery that's been placed through beadwork on clothing. And in this case, we also wanted to talk about the celestial bodies that were used for navigation in the north. So you can see on our artifact here, on our conceptual models, there's little beads that are meant to represent some stars. The snare, the rabbit snare. The snare was about tension. The snare was about this bent wood that would be used to catch a rabbit when it released. It was also about the respective transfer of life from one form to the next. Obviously, when catching an animal, they're giving up their life for you. And we wanted to represent that by this transfer of this whole from one plane to the other through this sheet of acrylic, which is meant to kind of represent that the change between living and death. So this one is a really kind of beautiful expression of not just the mechanics of a snare, but also kind of the mythology or the way of thinking about animals and when they're captured. Something that we always are looking at is this idea of landforms or landscape or place and what was there before, and understanding not just from a geological or soils content point of view, but understanding kind of the movements of water, of animals, of species. These concept models are meant to represent landforms and specifically drumlins that were left over from glacial movement in the north. And these were not only used for navigation, but they were also used to help hunt animals. They would create pathways in order to move animals in certain directions so that they could capture them. Very important to the northern people. And the last one here on this artifact display is the drum. So the drum can be thought of as the literal heartbeat of a nation. So drumming can be heard from miles away, and it was used to gather and call people together. So this artifact was amazing because when you held it, and if you're trying to be perfectly still holding this artifact, every time your heart would beat, the copper wires in the middle would vibrate. So really, it was kind of a translation of this heartbeat of a nation into an object. Some other key aspects to this are materiality. The use of copper is important to Indigenous people. And then the sinew and the way that these are wrapped together, the animal intestines that were used to wrap and used for tools and clothing. So continuing on with the same project, we did a couple of translations, and this one was really about place. The project was in Fort Smith, which is just up at the top of Alberta, just in the Northwest Territories. And we wanted to talk about the dichotomy between the number of daylight hours in the summer to the number of daylight hours in the winter. And you can see this is represented by the image on the right here. You can see a full sun cycle at the end of the wood there, going right down to a very slim sliver of a sun cycle in the winter. So marking the two solstices, the angle of repose on the acrylic is acknowledging the altitude of the sun at the highest point in the solstice. Really kind of think about this, how do you create something that's specific to that place and what does that represent? Continuing the ideas of craft and making. The other translation that we made is about the key things that were coming out of our artifacts, this idea of path, this idea of journey, this idea of movement, and how that could be represented in architectural form. So these are some objects that we were using just in order to get us to a point where we're not replicating or manufacturing just another teepee or just another longhouse or just another plank house. Really taking the ideas that are embedded in Indigenous ways of knowing and being and distilling them into forms that then can be used in the translation of architecture. Okay, so we're on to our last section here, which is in practice. So how we're manifesting these ideas in practice, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a perfect storm. And luckily we caught one of these perfect storms recently. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that project. It's called Bindigan, which means welcome in Anishinaabe. It's a collaboration between multiple service providers. And what I mean by that is that it's not developer driven. It's Deduata Desne, Nawasa, and Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services that are coming together to try and develop what one could call an Indigenous hub. The combination it's a combination of diverse uses. So you have housing, you have healthcare, you have childcare, you have a family center. So all these things that we're talking about, how to create community, how to create family. A shared space to support community and community events. And there's a push for multi-generational connections across the building, as seen by having childcare right on site. And one of the most important things is that it's leading with the land, with a connection to the land. Urban agriculture is really important on this site, which we're lucky. Like I said, it's a perfect storm. And then ideas of movement through the site as well. This is an aerial shot of Hamilton. You can see the escarpment running east to west through there. You can see the Skyway Bridge running up to the top side there. And then if you go directly down, you'll see a little red triangle. This is our site where it's located in Hamilton, right next to the Red Hill Valley Creek, which is also very important to Indigenous people. So just a quick zoom in here. There's three kind of shapes that you're looking at, the triangular site. But to the bottom left in the pink or light putty color is childcare. To the right is 3 levels of healthcare, and this is in combination with the master hospital. And then the arc to the top is the bottom floor of the residential portion, but that bottom floor also having other services like third-party commercial spaces, shared community spaces, loading docks, a food bank, all those types of things. So really kind of interesting in the way that this site is being developed, where there's a bunch of different service providers coming together, a bunch of different uses coming together to create something that's not just a one-off. I should also tell you that this site was a former Catholic school, and you can probably make that out in just the dash line, the red dash line there. Some logistics, how do we, because Nuwaisa is already using the space of the old school, how do we create portions of this building to make sure that we continue to build without having to tear down things without timely movement through the site. But those are just logistics. We'll get to that later. Some key ideas though that I want to talk about, and these are some renderings that we prepared, are ideas about urban agriculture. You can see here to the right is the residential portion. There's no balconies, or no individual balconies. Each floor has its own kind of community terrace, which is really intended to create a sense of community, but also help facilitate if elders need to go out to have their own garden where they don't want to go down into the larger landscape, they would be able to access community and food and being outside in that manner. Thinking about movement through the site as well, we're looking directly west here into what is the center gathering space. And that's really intended to host all the events that people would be gathering through, whether it's from the childcare or if there's healing events that are occurring through healthcare. The health center really meant to be a circular hub. The other piece that's kind of interesting is that these all come together in one area. So whether you're entering into health or into childcare or into the residential building, you're all going through the same central lobby space. Here's another view, thinking about the urban agriculture. Looks like they're growing agave there, probably going to be a tequila plant. But thinking about, how do we create spaces? How do we use landscape as not just an aesthetic function, but also providing place for people to grow their own food. And we were lucky enough that there was already an urban agriculture going on the site, very much kind of colonial in its layout, orthogonal rows with raised planters. We thought, how do we start to investigate the layout of plantings and growing food in a manner that's going to be relevant to the microclimates that are on site, to the amount of sun that it receives, to the angle that it's facing, to the soil conditions, whether it's wet or dry. And we did a bunch of mapping in our topography to figure out what's the best place to plant certain types of species, some that are frost resistant, and some that need more sun, some that need more shade, all those types of things. So it's really been a fun exercise. I should also mention that this work is done with KPMB. We've been teaming up with them on a number of projects, but really driving kind of these ideas forward. And this is a special project for us. Yeah. One more image. The idea about temporality and making sure that spaces are usable at night. And here you can see that central kind of entryway that all of the three buildings look into, so that'll be more of a central hub. People will be passing by, being able to see each other, whether they're going to the childcare or going home, or even living and working in the building. I think it'd be quite amazing. I'm going to speak about one more project here. It's called Odeto at Seneca. Really some ideas that we're pushing forward with this project is about embedding Indigenous knowledge in the architecture and planning of the project. It's intended to be a home away from home. It marks a place through acknowledgement of celestial movements. And it's a unique beacon on the campus for Indigenous life. So this is a fun project for us. We got brought on by the college to ride shotgun with another architecture firm. And you can see here this the kind of the unique arcing piece is the addition that we did, and there was a renovation to that end classroom, a little square piece. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that we were thinking about alignment. How do we think about directionality, and how does that engage with the movement of the natural systems of our world? And we wanted to acknowledge the rising of the sun on the summer solstice. And fortunately enough for us, the almost opposite, the setting of the sun on the winter solstice is almost exactly the opposite direction, as you can see by the sun path diagram at the top left there. So this is one of the key markers for us when starting this project, was how do we make this this building, this addition, acknowledged place without being subservient to the existing colonial building that's there. A little bit of a close-up view, and I'll just kind of outline here where the existing classroom was. Everything to the north of that was the addition. Also, everything to the north of the addition is a parking lot, so it wasn't a great view. South is down, north is up, so not a great area to be adding on, pretty much in shade. And we're on the backside of the campus as well. Some other things to note: the soil conditions on the site were terrible. There's a lot of contaminants in the soil that we had to deal with as well as part of this construction. So there's a few layers to the design that we were looking at there. One of the layers is a reference to a canoe pulling up to the shore and being turned on its side to create shelter. And this analogy, this idea of this overturned canoe, is really about creating a safe space, creating a home away from home for Indigenous students, which is one of our key drivers for this project. Another layer, this is the project under construction. You can see how brutalist the remainder of the campus is. Another layer is that this canoe form is somewhat similar to a longhouse or a teaching lodge. Seneca, being one of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy members, we felt it was important to honor this. So we try not to replicate historic forms in our work. never make a translated reference to them, as in this case with Odeta, where it's kind of a half moon approach. So a further layer is that the main structure has 28 ribs, each rib representing a day in the 13 moon cycles of our year, which is traditionally how we kept track of time. And these ribs are gently arced in plan and in section to recognize the rising sun in the summer solstice and the setting sun in the winter solstice. And further, the metal shingle work on the exterior of the building is in the pattern of the ever-growing tree wampum, which is significant to Haudenosaunee people, and our tree of great peace, the white pine. The cladding also has an anthropomorphic quality to it, reading as fish scales or the scales of a snake. I should also mention that this work was completed with Gow Hastings Architects in collaboration with Turo. Many of you may be wondering what Turo means. Turo is, or the Goswenta, is a wampum belt that records an agreement between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. The 2 rows of beads represent a canoe and a Dutch ship traveling down the St. Lawrence River on parallel paths, each moving forward together and not interfering in each other's affairs. This is how we like to work at 2 Row Architect, in collaboration, bringing together the strengths of both Western ways of being and knowing and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed your talk. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for questions. There's quite a few of us in the audience, so I really encourage people to ask questions either in the chat, and while people are getting that together, there is one here I'd like to ask you, and I'm just going to go up to where the chat is here. This comes from Safdor Edimian, and please forgive me if I'm not saying that right. And it is curious about pre-1967 Indigenous architecture prior to formalized training, that of like Douglas Cardinal. What was the Indigenous conception of design and built form coming from teachings and traditional pre-training? I hope I said that right.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that we looked at, and if we take a look back at, maybe I can pull this up so I'm not misquoting myself here. I'll take a look back at this chart here. So we talked a lot about kind of the blue line that was traveling through the original graph that I showed, which was about the steel walkers. And I mean, we as Indigenous people have been building structures that are relevant to our where we are in the landscape, what materials are immediately available to us. We've also been building things that move earth and mountains for thousands of years. If you take a look at anywhere in Mesoamerica, right up into along the Mississippi, there are mound building societies that have been demolished that we don't even really recognize anymore, but we were quite prevalent in moving earth and building strategically with the materials that are around us from a historic point of view. Contemporary ways of building is that I think that this creativity and this idea of being able to build is in our blood. You have the Ganawage Bridge, which was built by a lot of Mohawks that were right there. And that transferred into what we call the Skywalkers. And there's a whole other presentation that I've done on that before. And where Mohawks were the steel workers that built, the World Trade Centers, that built the Chrysler Building. And they've been doing it for 100 years because it was so embedded in their culture. I think that Indigenous people, the way we build is very much an understanding of how to use materials in a manner that's not only respectful, but that's creative to produce things that are quite unique to the place that they come from.
Thank you very much for that. I could also add that, pre-1967, well, 1961 actually, we weren't allowed in universities to educate ourselves as architects. So it was a little hard to become professional back then. But there was ways of traditional building in my community. In fact, where Matthew did his thesis, my home community of Fort Smith, Avacha, in the language. there was a vernacular that was already being built and had been for thousands of years, I suppose. So it was only, I think, Douglas sort of sparked that whole, the whole idea of being an architect, and so it was still bringing theory and ceremony into our ways of design. So thanks again. Thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us. Is there anybody? There's quite a few questions here now. I'm just going to grab another one from Hazel John. Could you tell us a bit more about the materials used in the presented projects in relation to the idea of universal inclusion?
Yeah, materials are a really interesting one because I think there's such an advancement of materiality, and even just right up to today, the way that we're thinking about building and how we're building. 20 years ago was about steel and concrete, and really now we're thinking about how do we use carbon sequestering materials such as wood. I mean, thousands of years ago, that's what we were using. And now we're kind of realigning with that way of thinking. So we are moving into glue laminated construction, CLT construction, sorry, cross laminated timber construction, more and more and more. And the projects that Two Row is doing individually are really promoting that. But the Bindigan project is intended to be a concrete kind of main floor and underground, and then above that will be in a wood construction, whatever it is, CLT or glue laminated, depending on when we get to that. Similar, you can see, Dato, the idea of structure as finish and expressing craft through the way that pieces are put together, not hiding connections, not putting things behind drywall, intended to reduce the amount of materials that we're using in buildings, but then also celebrate the natural beauty that wood brings us. There's something that's really lovely being wrapped in a wood room. It's very calming, and part of that shape is also that compression on the ceiling. For the people that are in there, it's very kind of a nice being like in a womb shape. So the combination of the form and the materiality is something that we've been looking at pushing forward in our work.
One last question, Matt, is that in your practice now, do you use some of these techniques, let's say with artifact, when you're designing a building, like for early concepts, or do you use ceremony or language?
Yeah, and I mean, it's always different. And there's something I should mention. If you go on Two Row's website, you'll see that every one of our projects looks different. There's not typical details that we recycle. It's not about a signature style. It's really about who are we working with and how are we working with them. And it ranges, James. It ranges from, we don't have any time to do consultations. So when we're in those moments, that's when we like to draw on our research and thinking about artifacts. When we have time to speak to people and to listen, that's when we like to build our ideas through conversation, through teachings, through ceremony, to actually being able to spend time on the land. So there's a full range of how we approach work depending on what the timeline is. I mean, we prefer to do the latter and listen first, but sometimes we have to think and translate. But it's a technique that we definitely use.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come to visit us and to talk to our school. Unfortunately, it's come to the end of our time together, but I want to thank Matthew Hickey for joining us for this Design Through the Indigenous Lens, Decolonizing Our Approach to Architecture. To see or register for any Daniels events this year, just ahead of the news, just go to the news and events page on the Daniels faculty website. Our next event is in the Daniels Talk series is with Douglas Cardinal, and I'll be moderating that when he talks with the students in the coming up this Thursday from 6 till 9 p.m. So I hope to see you all there again. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and please have a good afternoon, and hope you can join us Thursday night. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.